rational, or as emotional, subjective, and symbolic, the magician's operations may be viewed as actually accomplishing certain ends, or as symbolic expressions of their emotions and their desires. In Ludwig Wittgenstein's classic formulation, magic gives manifestation to a wish, it expresses a wish. 36. Echoing such earlier formulations, Joseph Gusfield suggests that in symbolic behavior the action is ritualistic and ceremonial in that the goal is reached in the behavior itself rather than in any state it brings about. 37. This pragmatist perception of ritual may be useful as a way for an observer to excuse someone else's otherwise irrational practice, but there is little evidence that most practitioners themselves view the effect of their rites as merely expressive and not objectively effective. 38. Magic rituals in medieval Europe were clearly intended to produce results, to arouse passion, to drive people mad, to find stolen goods, and so forth. Judicial evidence makes it clear that the practitioners, the clients and the victims all expected magic to have objective effect, and when it did not, this was because the specific practitioners were inept or did not perform rituals with sufficient strength to command the demons they summoned. 39. In one sense, however, Gusfield's formulation does apply to magic. Magical rites, like prayers of petition, may be used for practical ends, but any goals extrinsic to the ritual presuppose an effect intrinsic to it. The prayers and actions that constitute orthodox ritual first of all transform the relationship between the praying person and God, as also the relationship with the persons prayed for, with others in whose company one is praying, and with others throughout history who have said the prayer in question. If such ritual is transformative, the transformation is in the first instance one that occurs within the ritual itself. The participants in the ritual become different, and the network of relations in which they stand is reconfigured. Even if no further results ensue, for the duration of the ritual the world of the participant is transformed. Normally one undertakes a ritual with the expectation of further, extrinsic changes, moral or physical, but these are secondary, at least in a logical sense, however important they are to the participant. They are secondary because they presuppose a prior change within the ritual itself, an empowerment of the participant that then makes extrinsic change possible. Ritual can be effective for other purposes only if it first is effective as ritual. It can have secondary efficacy only by virtue of its primary efficacy. The principle holds in the case of magical rites, and perhaps most especially those involving demonic magic, even if they are undertaken for the sake of some practical end. That purpose can be accomplished only because within the ritual there is a transformed relationship between the magician and God, between the magician and the demons, and perhaps also between the magician and other humans. Calling upon the aid of God, the magician seeks power over the demons. The primary purpose of the ritual is to build sufficient power that the magician may compel the spirits to do his will. Only if within the ritual itself this transformation of power is attained can the magician accomplish any other goal. The efficacy of ritual ex opere operato must be perceived in this light. Thomas Aquinas was stating the common perception of theologians in the later Middle Ages when he recognized the Mass and sacraments as having objective effect independent of the disposition and moral status of the celebrant and minister. That ritual was inherently efficacious, ex opere operato, apart from any further effect to be gained by virtue of the minister's or participant's disposition, ex opere operantis, by no means meant that the rite was magical. Whether an operation qualified as magic or not depended chiefly on which powers it invoked. If it called upon celestial or manifest natural powers it was not magic, but if it appealed to demonic or occult natural powers it was magic. 40 rituals that called upon angelic aid formed an ambiguous category, possibly but not necessarily magical, but mainly because the identity of the angel summoned might be in doubt. 41. A ritual, magical or otherwise, could have efficacy ex opere operato, precisely because it transformed the status of the performer and his or her relationship with God, with other spirits, and with humans. It was clearly this fear of the efficacy of magic ex opere operato that led an actor playing in the Jeu de Saint Barbe in 1470 to make a notarized counterpact declaring that, by the invocations and anathemas of the demons which he makes in the play, he does not intend to speak from the heart but only in the manner of the play, and that on that account the enemy of humankind, the devil, should not have any claim on his soul. 42. But the force of magical ritual was not in all respects analogous to that of other rites. Ordinary prayer and official ritual assume that the spirits invoked are in general well disposed toward humankind, and enter readily into a helping relationship. The praying person's invocation of God or a saint is an appeal to a benevolent being. In this respect, the rituals of demonic magic differ from other rites. They invoke fallen spirits taken, by the necromancers as well as by their critics, to be unwilling, uncooperative, inimical and treacherous. The operations of demonic magic, more than other rituals, are thus explicit contests of wills. The necromancer recognizes a need to heap conjuration upon conjuration, and to buttress these formulas with supporting means of power, precisely because the demons are reluctant to come, and if they come will do everything in their power to escape the magician's control, threaten him, and deceive him. To gain the upper hand in the contest, the magician must hold the strongest possible means for power over the demons, and must adjure them in the name of all that is holy to come in non-threatening form, to cause no harm, and to tell only the truth. Yet all of these factors, far from undercutting Gusfield's analysis, actually strengthen it. They show how vitally important it was for the magician to focus his attention and his energies on the immediate consequences of his ritual action. His rites could be efficacious for extrinsic purposes only if they were first effective as rites, as ritual contests with cunning and powerful spiritual adversaries who could nevertheless be induced to fulfill his command. The function of language within magical ritual is a subject to be explored in detail when we examine formulas of conjuration in a later chapter. The general topic is one S.J. Tambia has discussed, with focus on the use of special languages, or the use of elements from various languages, in magical practice. 43 necromantic conjurations of the late Middle Ages are almost entirely in Latin, which marks them not as specifically magical but as similar to ordinary liturgical formulas. Some experiments give formulas in what is said to be Chaldean, thus making an appeal to the authority of ancient Jewish magic analogous to that of later Christian Kabbalists. But when a child medium is used, he is sometimes licensed to conjure the spirits in the vernacular. On one level, one might say that the choice of language is a matter of indifference. The demons or other spirits being conjured know all human tongues and can be addressed effectively in any of them. Yet in a different way, the selection of language was important, because it was only formulas in Latin that were clearly related to the prayers of mainstream liturgy. Necromancers who had command of Latin and could use it to demonstrate the groundedness of their rites in the liturgical tradition of the Church could no doubt gain readier acceptance as authentic masters of their art. And even if demons could understand other languages, they seemed, like God, to pay special attention when addressed in Latin. In any case, within medieval culture, magical words were seen as effective not per se but rather as means for evoking the effective presence of the archetypal powers to which they refer. Magical language is thus not in a simple sense the cause of efficacy but rather its occasion. The cause is a network of forces released and coordinated by the magician's verbal cue. The situation is analogous to that of the Eucharist. The priest's utterance of the words of consecration is not the cause of transubstantiation but rather the divinely ordained occasion for divine intervention. One might suppose that this distinction is too subtle to have been clear to the common necromancer, but in fact the point is clearly articulated in the conjurations themselves, which not only acknowledge but insist that the sources of their own power are the archetypal forces they bring to bear upon the situation at hand. The magic we are dealing with, then, borrows the conventions of liturgical prayer and has efficacy resembling that of the sacraments. In other respects, however, the fitting comparison is not so much with liturgy and sacraments as with the private devotions that were proliferating in the late Middle Ages, and the analogue to the Book of Magic is less the missal than the private prayer book. Ritual magic and devotions alike showed how liturgical formulas could be adapted for private and domestic use. Indeed, one central point of devotionalism was to provide a network of connections between church and home, bonding them in an increasingly complex relationship, and imparting to the home some of the fervor and sacrality of the church. Magic resembles the devotionalism of the Books of Hours and other prayer books in its translation of official rites into an unofficial and largely private setting. 44 books of magic, like books of devotion, proliferated in the expanding marketplace of privately owned and privately read texts. Plan of this book. The following chapter will introduce the manuscript to which this study is chiefly devoted. Subsequent chapters fall into two blocks. Chapters 3 to 5 examine the experiments according to the chief purposes for which they are performed: entertainment, illusionist experiments, power over other individuals, psychological ones, and knowledge, divinatory ones. The chief point of these chapters is to show that within this body of material there are in fact fairly clearly distinguishable subtraditions, and to sketch the common characteristics of each. Chapters 6 to 8, then, analyze the sources and techniques used to gain magical power, in particular the conjurations, and the demonology assumed by these conjurations, the magic circles, and the formulas of astral magic, techniques that cut across the categories discussed in the earlier chapters, and thus represent elements of continuity within the diversity of necromantic practice. Throughout the book I will give translations, my own, unless otherwise noted, of source material for the study of late medieval necromancy. Most of these passages are from the Munich Handbook. To give a sense of the cultural context, I have included some material from other writings of the magicians and from writings about and against demonic magic. I have opted not to give a complete translation of the Munich Handbook. Both specialists and general readers, I assume, will be better served by selective translation of representative and particularly interesting passages, selected perhaps disproportionately but not exclusively from the earlier sections of the handbook, integrated into my analysis. This option seems especially appropriate given the largely repetitive nature of the material, and the need to situate it in its cultural context. The Latin text is, in any case, available at the end of the volume for those who wish to probe more deeply. The limited improvement was due in part to models using only a small number of neurons. When larger populations were available, we observed more sizable improvements. For instance, when the population decoder considered 3 or more neurons, performance increased to 60.07.5%, relative to a performance of 55.86.0% provided by the single best neuron. We conclude that V4 population responses are predictive of perceptual deciscience in a fine orientation discrimination task, whereas V1 population responses contain much weaker signals. Decisions can be predicted from the responses of small populations, even when choice signals in individual neurons are, on average, barely evident. Animals' decisions are known to be influenced by their choice and reward history, especially if the task stimuli are near threshold. For instance, in the absence of strong sensory information, a subject might be more likely to repeat a decision if it led to a successful outcome on the previous trial.